Hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about what makes Tekken so special, and trust me, it's not only the fact that it has the worst online support of any game since the Sega Dreamcast. And the reason I'm thinking about this right now is we had a really interesting discussion about it on one of my recent streams, because one of my viewers asked me, do I think that being good at Tekken makes you better at other fighting games? Do I think that those skills are transferable to these other games? And my answer to that is actually a pretty resounding no. And it's interesting because with most other fighting games, I think the answer should probably be yes. For example, if you're really good at Guilty Gear, that probably means that you will do quite well in DNF Duel, and maybe even a lot of other fighting games that surface level seem very different, such as Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. So what is it that really sets Tekken apart, right? Well, I think many of you might already be saying to yourselves, that's very obvious, because Tekken is a 3D fighting game and these other games are 2D. Tekken is the last living great 3D fighting game franchise. Nobody cares about Virtua Fighter, and we let Soul Calibur 6 die. That was a sin, but a sin that we committed, right? And now we're only left with Tekken, and it's a 3D fighting game, which makes it very different. Well, I actually think the reason it's difficult to transfer a skill set from Tekken to these other games doesn't have that much to do with the game being 3D. It's not as big of a factor as you might think. I think there are other more important differences at play here. So let's get into them a little bit. I think, first of all, the main difference that I want to get to is the difference between how mix-ups work in the different fighting games, and also how you open up against somebody who's guarding, and also how you guard against those mix-ups. So right now we're in DNF Duel, right, which is the new fighting game that I'm really enjoying so far. I think it's fantastic. It has some issues with its combo system. The combos are a little bit too long. Some characters seem to have real infinites, which is a problem, but apart from that, I think it's a fantastic and really fun game. Well, the way it works in almost all of these 2D fighting games when you want to defend is you're going to be crouch blocking for the most part, because that allows you to block almost all the different incoming attacks, but there are exceptions to that. So for example, the grappler is going to attack me with a couple of normal attacks right here, and you can say that even when he attacks low, I'm going to block all these attacks as long as I am crouch guarding, right? So I'm blocking, but then this final attack when he's jumping, that jumps over my guard and kicks me in the head, that actually breaks through the crouch guard, because as you probably know, this attack is something known as an overhead. And this is a really, really big difference between Tekken and these other games, right? Because when you guard in the 2D fighting game, you want to sit and crouch for the most part, and then for you to be able to stay secure on the defensive, you have to try and predict when these overhead attacks are coming. And for the most part, they're actually pretty slow to animate and quite deliberate, right? So you can become very good at knowing or predicting when the overhead is going to come, or even react to it, and then all you have to do is stand back up and guard normally from a standing position, and that will allow you to block that attack. And then of course the other thing you can do to open up against an opponent is throwing, and throwing, in my opinion, is quite a lot more powerful in these 2D fighting games compared to Tekken, because if you want to break, or tech as they say in 2D games, we call it breaking a throw in Tekken, you have to predict it. So it's a different skill set. In 2D fighting games, teching a throw is a hard read. In Tekken, it's based in reaction speed, because you can react to and break throws in Tekken, right? Okay, so why is that so extremely different from Tekken? Well, in Tekken, crouching is extremely dangerous, and becoming good at defending or playing Tekken at all has a lot to do with knowing when to crouch, and you should do it really very rarely. And if you want to successfully apply a mix-up and attack an opponent in Tekken, that has to do with tricking or forcing that opponent into crouching when they really shouldn't be doing that, right? The reason it works like that in Tekken is that when you stand up normally in Tekken, you block all mids and all highs unless they're unblockable or they're throws, but you're not able to block low attacks when you're stand guarding. So that's the same. But when you then crouch in Tekken, you're now able to block all of the low attacks. The high attacks are going to go over your head and just completely whiff, which can open up these interesting while standing attack opportunities. But when you're crouching in Tekken, all the mid attacks become guaranteed hits. And in Tekken, mid attacks tend to be the most powerful moves because they have this powerful intersection of relatively high impact speed. They're generally faster than lows, a little bit slower than highs, but then they have fantastic properties overall. They tend to lead to full combos, right? So if you crouch when you're not supposed to in Tekken, you can eat one of these powerful mids, such as a down 4-2 or a hop kick, and you're going to eat an entire combo for that, and you might even lose the round, which means that in Tekken, we do not want to crouch almost at all. We only do it when we have a very hard read. We think we know that a high or a low is coming, and we want to deal with that specifically. And even then, we might do something different, such as a universal low parry that goes in a little bit deeper into that system, right? So crouching in Tekken is very, very dangerous when you're on the defensive, but it's the default position when you're playing all of these other games. And so the big difference that I sense when I'm trying to play a 2D fighting game compared to Tekken, and the reason that it's very difficult to go from one to the other, is that when I'm trying to be on the defensive, instinctively, what I want to do is use my movement, including my 3D movement, of course, sidestepping, but the Korean backdash cancel, which is this very evasive and important movement technique in Tekken, and then I want to stand block like this for as long as possible. And that is eventually going to give me the opportunity to actually retaliate against my opponent, because in these 2D fighting games, you can keep on attacking like a lot. You can attack and get blocked and still keep on attacking and trying to mix. Whereas in Tekken, unless you're applying these really long aggressive strings, you can't really do that because you actually give up your turn and give it back to the opponent. So as long as you walk back and block, and try not to crouch when you're not supposed to, you're going to do okay in Tekken, but you're going to get destroyed in these 2D fighting games. And I think because that is like the most basic thing you have to learn when you start a new fighting game, how do I defend? How do I not instantly die? It becomes very counterintuitive. But I think there is one fighting game where your Tekken skill set will actually transfer very well. And we already mentioned it. It is Soul Calibur, because in Soul Calibur, the mix-up system and how we defend is very similar to Tekken. The one big thing that you have to adapt to when you go from Tekken to Soul Calibur is the fact that guarding doesn't happen automatically or when you hold backwards. It actually has a guard button similar to DNF Duel right here, and then you have specific actions tied to that guard button, such as GI, and something similar to GI exists in this game as well. But I think Soul Calibur is much, much closer, and you're thinking a lot in the same way. Soul Calibur is actually, in my opinion, the purest 3D fighting game out there. It's the 3D fighting game where movement matters a lot. I mentioned that I don't think Tekken being 3D is that huge of a factor when it comes to comparing these games. It is a huge factor, but maybe not as big as people suppose, because I think the vast majority of Tekken players don't actually utilize and think about 3D space enough. You have to get to a certain level of Tekken play before people really start worrying about tracking and sidestepping the way you're supposed to really, utilize 3D space. And 3D more comes into play when you're thinking about things like get-up options and stuff, because you can get up into the background and foreground and, tech rolls and things like that. But with Soul Calibur, you have very, very free and open 3D movement because you have that 8-way run. And so you're much less locked into this more restrained 3D grid the way you are in Tekken. So how does Soul Calibur balance out the fact that movement is so much more powerful? Because a lot of people did not enjoy Tekken Tag 2 having such powerful movement. That's the previous game of the Tekken franchise, by the way. It had much more freer movement than we have in Tekken 7, and newer players were frustrated with that because it meant that a good player could evade almost everything with their fast movement, and they were very difficult to hit. I think that's the main reason they chose to restrain movement when they eventually released Tekken 7. So how do they deal with that in Soul Calibur? Well, in Soul Calibur, it's really interesting because we don't have, necessarily these fast attacks and then slightly heavier attacks and then specials. Soul Calibur actually divides its different attack categories into planes, into geometric planes. So you have attacks that are extremely vertical, and then you have attacks that are extremely horizontal, and you have a lot of them. And that means that almost half of your move list is specialized in catching people who are moving to the sides. And so if you are a Tekken player, and this is what I said on stream, the way you can think about it is, imagine if I buffed your movement in Tekken threefold. I gave you a sidestep that's better than Lily's sidestep. I gave you the ability to run in more directions much easier and much faster, but I then gave you generally more range on all of your attacks. But then I made half of your entire move list into homing moves that specialize in attacking people who are moving to the sides. That is how Soul Calibur works with neutralizing the overpoweredness of movement. In Tekken, they thought it was a better idea to restrain the movement and make it so that you have to make very deliberate choices and know exactly what you're doing with movement to actually make it work. And another reason I don't think being 3D is as much of a factor of difference as people might think is that we kind of have as many dimensions in the 2D fighting games as we do in Tekken, because in these 2D fighting games you spend a lot of time in the air and you spend a lot of time jumping, and that is something that just doesn't happen in Tekken. In Tekken 7 we have a couple of characters who like to jump, but they generally come from these 2D fighting games. It's something that we've borrowed from them because Namco were working on a crossover game between Tekken and Street Fighter called Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and that is why we ended up with Akuma and Elisa, for example, in Tekken, who like to jump. But apart from that, jumping is considered something that you're basically never supposed to do in Tekken, with very few exceptions. And jumping is generally considered to be a missed input when you see it in Tekken. You're not supposed to do it, and so you can neutralize a lot of attacks and stay very evasive in a 2D fighting game using your jumping and staying in the air. And in some fighting games it's very true. Look at Guilty Gear Strive with the air dashing and everything. You can do so much and basically never land. Just think about Marvel 3. So I think people overestimate how much freedom you actually have when it comes to space and movement inside that space in Tekken. And I think the way mix-ups work and the way we think about defending and defending against mix-ups, applying them, but then also throws and these other things are actually the big thing that make it difficult to transfer your skill set from Tekken to the other games. And I think a good example of that being true is when Soul Calibur 6 came out. I'm a very dedicated Tekken player for the most part. It's the only fighting game that I play a lot. I could jump into Soul Calibur, pick a character and spend, a day in practice mode and then start playing ranked. And as long as I remembered my block button, I could do really well, and I actually started ranking up very fast in that game and doing quite well at it. Whereas when I started playing, Guilty Gear or a game like this, or when I play Third Strike, there's a much bigger difference, and what I really struggle with is specifically defense, because crouching when you're a Tekken player does not feel good. It feels like you're doing something wrong and you really don't want to do it, right? So I hope that video is interesting enough, and I hope that it answers that question a little bit. I'm going to keep practicing Vanguard right now, who's probably my favorite character in this game, but I have to say I think DNF Duel might have the best roster I've ever seen in a new fighting game, and that's impressive considering how small it is. I'm having a lot of fun with these different characters, and hopefully I can develop enough of a skill set at this game that I can become decent at it as well. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys again very soon.